The envelope was heavy, not because of the paper it carried, but because of what it meant. The principal didn't even look her in the eye when he handed it over, just placed it on the desk, cleared his throat and said, "This is not an easy decision, but several parents have expressed concern." She didn't speak. She couldn't, because her mother was sitting right next to her, gripping her hand so tightly it almost hurt, not out of panic, but to hold back everything that wanted to explode from inside her. The words kept coming, each one colder than the last. "It's been brought to our attention that her presence is unsettling, disruptive, makes some students feel unsafe." What did she do? Did she fight? No. Did she yell? Never. She answered questions. She asked better ones. She challenged the textbook. She read Malcolm X in a classroom full of kids who'd never even heard his name. She wore her natural hair. She didn't hide her voice. That was the threat. The paper on the desk said, "disciplinary grounds," but no one could name a rule she broke. It was the silence that followed her every answer in class, the way teachers hesitated before calling her name, the way parents avoided her mother at PTA meetings, the way some students whispered the word aggressive when she raised her hand. Now here she was, 14 years old, expelled from the only school she ever knew, not for cheating, not for violence, but for making them uncomfortable. Her mom wanted to protest, call a lawyer, call the press, but her daughter, she just looked down at that envelope and said, "Don't worry, I'll build one better." The principal didn't flinch, didn't even blink. But something changed in the room, because it wasn't just the end of something. It was the beginning. It didn't start with the expulsion. It started long before that, with the silence. The kind of silence that followed her down every hallway. The kind where teachers stop talking when she walks in. Where desks shift slightly away from hers in group assignments, as if by instinct. Where laughter dies out when she opens her lunchbox and they realize she eats differently. She was smart, but not the kind they celebrated. Her answers were always right, but somehow always too much, too bold, too intense, too her. One day she wrote an essay on colonialism. The teacher gave it back with no grade, just a red question mark, no feedback, no explanation, just a quiet message. Don't go there. Another time, she stayed after class to ask about a science fair. She was told the slots were full. The next day, a boy who hadn't even signed up was added last minute. He built a volcano. She had planned to present her homemade solar battery. She sat alone during lunch. Not because she wanted to, but because every table had an unspoken rule. Don't sit here. And still, she smiled. Every day she showed up, pressed her uniform, polished her shoes, held her head high, until one afternoon in history class, she raised her hand and said, "Why don't we learn about people who look like me?" The teacher paused, looked down, said, "That's not the curriculum." But the room had already gone still. Someone muttered, "There she goes again." And someone else, laughing just loud enough, said, "Of course she made it about race." She didn't flinch, but she never raised her hand again. The room smelled like lemon-scented floor polish and something colder, formality. 4 adults sat behind a desk too wide, too polished, too clean to feel real. On the other side, she sat with her mother, legs tucked together, hands locked in her lap, eyes fixed on a crack in the linoleum floor. She already knew this wasn't a meeting. It was a verdict. A man in a beige suit with kind eyes and a clipped voice cleared his throat before speaking. "We called this meeting to discuss some ongoing concerns." That word again. Concerns. Not behavior, not performance. Just vague, shapeless concerns that everyone felt but no one could name. Her mother straightened in her chair, sharp and calm like a lawyer who had been here before. "My daughter has never had a detention, never missed a homework. Her grades are stellar. So what exactly are you concerned about?" A woman with thin glasses and a folder full of empty pages leaned forward. "There have been complaints, not from teachers necessarily, but from some parents, some students." "What kind of complaints?" her mother shot back. The man shifted uncomfortably. It's The tone she uses, the way she responds. It's not inappropriate, just intense, and sometimes makes others uncomfortable. There it was, that word, the one that always crawled into the room when they had nothing else to say. Uncomfortable. She could feel her mother's pulse rising through the hand still resting over hers. But neither of them spoke. The woman continued, this time softer, like she was trying to be kind. We believe this environment might not be the best fit for her. It's not a matter of punishment. It's about finding a place where she can truly thrive. It was dressed up like concern, like care, but it wasn't. It was exile wrapped in empathy. She wanted to scream, to ask, what exactly about me doesn't fit here? My hair, my voice, my questions? But she didn't. Instead, she watched as her mother inhaled sharply, stood up slowly and said, So you're asking us to leave, because she makes you see things you don't want to? Silence, the kind that confirms everything, the kind that doesn't need to be answered. The hallway to the administrative wing was colder than the rest of the building. She had walked it before, once to deliver a late attendance slip, once to ask about a field trip form that somehow never reached her desk. But today, every fluorescent light hummed like a warning, and every step her shoes made on the tile floor echoed with something final. Her mother walked beside her in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because they both knew words would be twisted in that room. At the door marked Student Conduct and Affairs, a woman with tightly pinned hair and a tight-lipped smile greeted them, not with warmth, not with concern, but with that bureaucratic hospitality that meant, this is a formality, not a discussion. Inside sat 5 people. 2 were teachers she recognized but had never been taught by. One was a school counselor who always smiled too wide but never made eye contact in the hallway. Another was the vice principal, a man with calloused hands and a face that always looked like it was waiting for an excuse to frown. And at the center, the principal, the same one who, 3 months earlier, had shaken her hand at an honor roll assembly and said, You're going places. Now. He barely nodded. The table in front of them had a stack of papers, printed emails, parent letters. She couldn't read them, but she could feel the weight they carried, stories told without her voice in them. The vice principal began reading, not to her, to the record. Student exhibits repeated patterns of confrontation with faculty and peers, demonstrates a tendency to monopolize classroom discussion, has failed to respond appropriately to redirection. Her mother raised her hand. Excuse me, what do you mean by confrontation? The counselor, gently, as if offering a favor, replied, She tends to ask questions that challenge authority, sometimes in ways that make other students uncomfortable. That word again. It always came back to that. Uncomfortable, not unsafe, not dangerous, just difficult to ignore. She listened as examples were read aloud. When she asked why the civil rights movement was only covered in 1 paragraph, when she questioned why there was no Black History Month event that year, when she refused to change her presentation topic from systemic bias in standardized testing to something less political. Every item was real. Every moment had happened. But the way they said it, the way they stacked it, folded it, repackaged it into a pattern, it made her sound like a problem that needed to be solved. She looked around. None of them met her gaze. They weren't speaking to her. They were speaking over her, speaking about her in front of her, like she wasn't even there. Her mother's voice cut through. Is she being punished for being right? The principal leaned forward, rested his hands on the table and said, This is not about right or wrong. It's about cohesion. This school thrives when everyone feels included, and right now that's not the case. She wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it all, the hypocrisy of being excluded in the name of inclusion, was too heavy to cry about. The decision, of course, had already been made. There would be no warning, no second chance. The paperwork was signed. The envelope was sealed. She stood up. For a second, she thought her knees might give out, but her mother's hand found her back, like a steady flame. She didn't look back at the table, didn't offer them the satisfaction of a final glance. She just whispered to herself, barely audible. Let them keep their school. I'll build one they'll never get invited to. And walked out. The house was too quiet that night. Not the comforting kind of quiet where the hum of the fridge and the ticking clock filled the corners of the room. No, this was the kind of silence that pressed against the windows, settled into the couch cushions, and crawled up the walls until even the air felt like it didn't want to speak. She sat on her bed, the expulsion letter lying unopened on her desk across the room. She didn't need to read it. Every word was already carved into her memory. Not because they were loud, but because they were delivered so gently, so cleanly, that it hurt more. Her mother was in the next room, on the phone, talking to someone, a friend, a cousin, maybe a lawyer. But her voice was low, tired, not broken, just bent. The door to her room was open, always had been. But tonight, it felt like a portal to something else. A reminder that no one would be knocking on it in the morning to say, "Hurry up, or you'll miss the bus." There would be no bus, no homeroom, no crowded lockers or announcements over the PA system, no classroom debates, no cafeteria stares, no back row snickering, just space, too much of it, and the feeling that she had been erased, but everyone else still expected her to keep living like she hadn't noticed. She thought about the projects she wouldn't present, the tests she wouldn't take, the college prep that would now be someone else's concern. All of it suspended, like her. Her phone buzzed once, a message from Mariah. "Hey, I heard what happened. Just wanted to say I'm sorry. That's messed up." She stared at the screen for a long time. Mariah had sat next to her in English class for almost a year. They had shared headphones once, laughed at the same dumb jokes. But now that it was over, all Mariah could offer was an apology, sent quietly, late at night, so no one else would see. She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The ceiling above her felt lower than usual, like the whole world had decided to lean in just a little, make the air thinner, the night longer, the thoughts louder. Her mother came in eventually, holding a mug of tea, and sat on the edge of the bed. "They don't know who they just pushed out," she said softly. And for the first time all day, she looked up and met her mother's eyes. "I don't want to just be angry, Mom," she said. "I want to do something they can't ignore." Her mother didn't answer right away. She just nodded, slowly, firmly, like someone who had waited her whole life to hear that from her daughter. Then came the words that would stay with her forever. "Then don't rebuild what they broke. Build what they never had the vision to imagine." The silence didn't feel as heavy after that. It still hurt, but now it had a shape. And someday it would have a purpose. The next morning came without a purpose. No alarm clock, no school uniform folded on the chair, no rush to catch the bus, no mental rehearsal of test questions on the way out the door, just the hollow rhythm of a house trying to remember how to hold a child who no longer belonged to the world outside its walls. She sat at the kitchen table in sweatpants in silence, tracing the edge of a chipped mug with her finger. Her mother moved around quietly, cutting fruit, boiling water, offering gestures instead of words, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile shape her daughter's resolve had begun to take. The TV in the living room whispered the morning news. Budget cuts, a local crime, a sports score. Nothing that mattered, not to her, not anymore. She picked up her old backpack from the floor, still heavy with books she no longer had a classroom for, and unzipped it. Out came the essays, the notes, the annotated textbooks. Out came the award certificate from the writing competition they never announced at the assembly. Out came the paper she'd written about systemic bias in grading, the one her teacher returned without comment, with only a red circle around the title, and a suggestion, maybe choose a less controversial topic next time. She stared at that note for a long time. Not out of hurt, but clarity. "Less controversial," she muttered, "like pretending none of this exists?" Her mother sat across from her now, sipping tea and watching her with the kind of attention that said, "I won't push, but I'm here." She finally spoke. "What if we made our own class?" Her mother blinked, Not in disbelief, but in recognition, like that idea had always been there, lingering between them, waiting for someone brave enough to say it out loud. Not just for me, she added. For anyone like me. Kids who get kicked out, or shut down, or erased before they even get started. Her voice was calm now, measured, but every word carried weight, like bricks being laid for something bigger. We don't need permission. We just need a room. Her mother smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't dramatic. It was tired, proud, dangerous. We've got a garage, she said quietly. She didn't smile back, not yet, because this wasn't a dream. It was the beginning of a blueprint. The flyer was simple, black text on white paper, bold letters at the top. Free education support, by students for students. Below that, her email, a list of subjects, a note that said, all backgrounds welcome. She and her mother printed 20 of them at the corner store. They taped them to bus stops, slipped them into mailboxes, left them folded into the pages of books at the library. Each one felt like a breath they were pushing into the world, hoping someone would breathe it in. They turned the garage into something that looked almost like a classroom. Moved out the paint cans, swept the dust from the corners, hung an old whiteboard salvaged from a thrift store. She stacked her textbooks on one side of a folding table. Her mother brought in a lamp and a small heater. It wasn't much, but it was more than what she'd been offered. The first Saturday she woke up early, put on a pressed shirt, braided her hair, reviewed her notes. She even made a tiny sign to hang on the garage door. Learning happens here. She sat and waited. 10 qm, nothing. 10:15, a car passed by but didn't stop. 10:30, she adjusted the whiteboard markers. 11y. Her mother peeked in and offered tea. She shook her head. By noon the air was still. Her hands were cold, her heart colder. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't disappointed, she was, but because something inside her had already begun to harden into steel. When she walked back into the house, her mother met her with a towel in one hand and a raised eyebrow. How'd it go? She didn't answer, just nodded. Her mother smiled, dry, sardonic, almost amused. Good. Now let's print 40 more. The next week, she added a line to the flyer. Taught by a student expelled for asking the right questions. She didn't want to be quiet anymore. She wanted to be undeniable. It was raining that Saturday. Not the kind of storm that howls and crashes, but the kind that just falls steadily, without pause. It tapped against the garage roof like a soft warning. She was there again, sitting at the folding table, the same textbooks stacked in hopeful rows, the whiteboard wiped clean and waiting. This was her third weekend. Last week, no one had come. The week before that, an old man had wandered in thinking it was a church donation drive. But today, she had come anyway. Same pressed shirt, same braids, same determination behind tired eyes. And then it happened. Not a bang, just a small, uncertain knock on the garage door. She stood, heart racing, afraid it was someone delivering a complaint, afraid it was a mistake, afraid it wasn't real. But when she opened the door, she saw him. A boy, maybe 12, thin jacket, crooked glasses, soaked sneakers. He looked past her, into the garage, and asked, "Is this the school?" She didn't answer right away, because how do you explain that something isn't a school? Not officially, not by state standards, not by any rule book, but that it feels more like one than anywhere else. So she just stepped aside and said, "Yeah, come in." He walked slowly, looking around like it was a museum. He touched the edge of the whiteboard, traced a finger over the stack of books. "My cousin said you don't give grades," he mumbled. "We don't," she said. "We give ideas." He nodded, then sat down, right there, at the table. She blinked. Suddenly, everything in the room felt louder. The heater's hum, the tapping rain, the rustling of notebook pages she had almost given up on. "You like science?" she asked. He nodded again. "But they said I'm not smart enough." that I can't sit with the others." Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened a folder, pulled out a page, her notes from a lesson plan she thought no one would ever hear, and began. They studied for an hour, then 2, and when he left, he said nothing. He just smiled. The next week, he brought 2 friends. By the 5th week, the chairs were full. They had started with 2 plastic ones from the backyard. Now there were 12 mismatched seats, folding stools, milk crates, even a beanbag someone brought from home. The whiteboard was no longer blank. Every Saturday it was filled with equations, timelines, vocabulary words, and questions. Always questions. The garage was loud now, not with shouting, but with thinking, laughter, curiosity, that electric hum of young minds that had finally found a space that didn't shrink them. She wasn't a teacher by title, but every time someone said, "Wait, I get it now," she felt more like one than anyone who had ever stood in front of her in a classroom. Her mother would peek in, sometimes bringing snacks, sometimes just standing silently in the doorway, watching something grow that neither of them had fully imagined. One afternoon, during a break, a student named Tariq pulled out his phone. "You know this is going viral, right?" She frowned. "What is?" He showed her a clip, filmed quietly during a session, of her explaining how history isn't just about remembering names, but about who gets remembered and why. It had over 50,000 views. The caption read, "Expelled for asking too many questions. Now she's teaching a new generation how to ask better ones." She froze, not out of fear, but because she knew what this meant. Eyes were turning. That night, she received 3 emails from local families. One said, "My daughter's struggling. Can she join you?" Another asked, "Would you consider doing this full-time?" The last one simply read, "You're doing what the schools won't." But not all the messages were kind. A former teacher sent a private message. "Careful. You're stepping into things you don't understand." Another warned her anonymously, "If you're not licensed, what you're doing might be illegal." She didn't respond, not because she didn't care, but because she had students to prepare for. That Saturday, a black SUV parked across the street. No one got out. It just sat there, watching. She closed the garage door, but not before taping a new sign on it. "This is not a classroom. This is a revolution." It started with a letter, not handwritten, not even addressed to her directly. It was sent to her mother's name from the State Department of Education, with a seal at the top and 6 paragraphs of legal language below. Operating an unregistered educational program without certified instructors constitutes a violation of Section 14(3). She didn't finish reading it. She had already heard the message. Shut it down. They called it unauthorized. They said it posed risks to minors. They claimed her lack of formal training was potentially harmful. But not one of them had walked into that garage. Not one had seen the students come alive when they were asked what they thought instead of told what to memorize. She wasn't alone anymore. The students were now coming from 3 different neighborhoods. A father from the community offered to donate an old projector. A retired teacher volunteered to help with Saturday math sessions. Local businesses started leaving fresh fruit and water at the door without asking for recognition. But the noise was growing louder. A local news channel picked up the story. They showed a blurry image of her whiteboard, quoted the flyer out of context, and posed the question, "Is this a heroic student or a dangerous precedent?" She watched the segment in silence. Her mother crossed her arms, seething. The footage never showed a single smiling kid, only the shot of the SUV outside, only the words, unlicensed, defiant, potential lawsuit. She turned off the TV. "So that's how they're going to play it," she said. Her mom nodded. "They always do." That night, a knock came, not from a student, but from a man in a gray suit with an official badge. "We're here to inform you that your educational activity must cease immediately until appropriate licensure is obtained." She didn't speak, didn't argue. She just closed the door. and pulled out a notebook. The first thing she wrote was, "If they can't stop you from learning, they'll try to stop you from teaching." The second was, "We need a space they can't shut down." That was the night she stopped thinking like a student and started planning like a founder. The garage could no longer hold them. There were too many students, too many questions, too much heat in the summer, and not enough light when the clouds rolled in. Some kids were now sitting outside on overturned crates, leaning into the doorway just to hear her voice. Others took turns standing near the whiteboard, scribbling ideas, challenging each other in ways no one had ever asked them to before. It was beautiful, but it wasn't sustainable. The letter from the state still hung on the fridge, not out of fear, but as a reminder. Every time she saw it, she thought, "They want me to stop, because I didn't ask." So this time she would still not ask, but she would make it bigger than they could ignore. She opened her laptop one night and typed, "How to start a non-profit," then, "Community grant programs for youth education," then, "Vacant buildings for lease in urban neighborhoods." The searches led to articles. The articles led to forms. The forms led to deadlines and signatures and tax ID numbers. It wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. But for the first time, she wasn't fighting to prove she deserved a seat at someone else's table. She was building her own. Her mother came home from a late shift to find the kitchen covered in documents, floor plans, budget estimates, notes scrawled on receipts and napkins. "Are we really doing this?" she asked. The girl looked up, her eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks. "No, Mom, we're not doing this. I am, but I need you to believe I can." Her mother didn't hesitate. She grabbed a pen and started highlighting. They weren't alone for long. Tariq's mother donated her old office printer. The retired math teacher offered to co-sign the lease. An old church on the west side offered them one wing of the basement. Cheap, dusty, but wide enough for 20 desks. One evening, she stood inside that church wing, surrounded by peeling paint and cracked windows, and said out loud, "This isn't a classroom. It's proof. Not of rebellion, not of anger, but of a simple truth the system refused to say. We were never the problem. You just never made room." And now, they would make the room themselves. The room was full, not with rows of chairs or name tags or flashing cameras, but with people, real people. Kids who had been suspended for disrupting class. Girls who had been labeled loud before they ever learned to speak up. Boys who were told they couldn't lead before anyone let them try. Parents who had sat in meetings with folded hands and forced smiles, pretending to agree just to get through the school year. Now they were here, filling a repainted church basement, sitting on chairs they brought themselves, wearing shirts that said, "We are the curriculum." There was no stage, just a podium borrowed from a youth center and a microphone that buzzed every few minutes. She stood in front of them in a plain white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, hair in a bun. Because this wasn't a show, it was a statement. The mayor had been invited. He didn't come. The school board had been notified. No one replied. Reporters had asked if she had a license. She said, "I have something better. I have results." She cleared her throat. The crowd quieted instantly, not out of obligation but respect. I was told I made people uncomfortable. A ripple of recognition passed through the room. She didn't smile, didn't pause for effect, just kept going. They said my voice was too strong, my questions too difficult, my presence too much. So I built a place where presence isn't a threat. It's the point. She gestured to the walls, still chipped in places, still imperfect. This is not a school in the way they define it. It doesn't fit their mold, and that's exactly why it matters. Applause broke out, short but fierce. In the back row, her mother stood with arms crossed, eyes full. Then a student, one of the first, stepped forward. It was the boy with the crooked glasses, now standing tall, wearing a clean backpack and a grin that had become permanent. He held up a book. "She didn't just teach me math," he said. "She made me want to learn it." Another student followed. "She taught me how to ask questions, real ones, the kind that don't have answers in the back of the book. A third. I was invisible at my old school. Here, I'm not just seen, I'm understood. They came up one by one, not to perform, not to impress, but to testify. And as the room swelled with claps and laughter and a few tears, she stepped back. She wasn't crying. She had done enough of that already. She was witnessing. What started as an act of defiance had become a sanctuary. Not just for the kids, for anyone who had ever been told they were too much. They cut the ribbon, not red, but yellow. Not for tradition, but for warning. Because this was no longer just a school. It was a signal. If the system won't change for us, she said quietly to a friend beside her, then we'll become the system. As people filed out, one woman paused at the door and asked, "What do we call this place?" She thought for a moment, then answered, "Call it whatever you want, but know this. Once you walk through those doors, you'll never shrink yourself again.